Good evening and welcome. Before we dive into introductions, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants of the areas that the League of Women Voters of Santa Monica represents. Leagues at all levels are committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion in policy and in practice. And land acknowledgements are a part of our efforts toward becoming a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive organization. Our our league represents the areas of Santa Monica and Malibu, which are the traditional lands of three tribal nations, the Chumash, the Tongva, and the Kizh. We recognize that an acknowledgement is only the first step in working with Native communities to secure meaningful partnership and inclusion in stewardship and protection of their cultural resources and homelands. We encourage you to learn more about Native lands, and a great resource is native-land.ca, which has maps of tribal nations and other educational resources. We're grateful that you're able to join us this evening as we address the elephant in the room. I'm not actually talking about Ellie. This is the League of Women Voters of Santa Monica's first event of a monthly speaker series discussing the causes, current issues, and potential solutions to our current housing crisis. My name's Natalia Zernitskaya, and I currently serve as the president of the League of Women Voters of Santa Monica. We are a nonpartisan political organization that works to support informed and active participation in government. Housing has been a major topic of interest for the League, especially in recent history. But as we know, it's a very large topic. So tonight's focus is a little more focused, exploring housing in Santa Monica. How did we get here, and where do we go from here? Tonight's panelists in order of presentations are Joss Tillard-Gates, Frank Gruber, Judy Abdo, and Jason Islas. And tonight's moderator is Darlene Evans. Darlene is a longtime resident of Santa Monica, a lawyer and a community participant. She is currently a member of the League of Women Voters, the Santa Monica College General Advisory Board, Santa Monica Travel and Tourism, FAME Redevelopment Corporation, and the custodial chair of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Westside Coalition. Each of tonight's panelists will speak to a specific piece of the history of housing in Santa Monica, followed by Q&A moderated by Darlene. And in order to keep us to time this evening, we will have Kathy Gentili timing our panelists' presentations. She'll give us a heads up when the presentation has reached 8 minutes to allow the panelists to finish their remarks. We have received some audience questions ahead of time, and we welcome you to add your questions via the Q&A feature. As there are likely to be many questions asked, we won't be able to get to all of them, unfortunately. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Darlene to introduce our first panelist.
Hi, everybody. Our first panelist is going to be Joss Tillard-Gates. He's a senior program director in the area of policy for Enterprise Community Partners, a national nonprofit that addresses America's affordable housing crisis from every angle, combining 40 years of experience, thousands of local partners, and the expertise of over 1,100 employees nationwide. In addition to his work with Enterprise, Josh also serves on the boards of the Southern California Association of Nonprofit Housing and Abundant Housing LA.
Thank you, Darlene, for the introduction. And good evening to everybody that's here joining us. Again, my name is Joss Tillard-Gates, and I'm with Enterprise Community Partners. And what I'm going to discuss with you for a few moments is the history of redlining throughout Los Angeles. We're going to keep it really in that general vicinity you'll see behind me in my background. And the reason why I want to, discuss it in a kind of a holistic point of view is it's hard to understand the effects of redlining and how it and the effects that it had on Santa Monica's housing, its current housing stock, without getting the full picture. So I do want to give you a chance, and I don't know if you're changing views on your computer or if you zoom in. If you can see the red areas, there are red, yellow, green, and there's some blue. Now, those are going to be areas that come with area descriptions that are going to allow property owners in those areas or potential property owners to get a mortgage. Now, all of the white that you'll see on that map is not zoned for residential, or it's just totally undeveloped land. Okay, so that's the context for the colors on the map. And that's where we get the term redlining from, is those areas that are lined in red. Now, the focal point and probably the crux of this topic area is understanding what was happening during this time period. And this is a map from 1929. So if you go back in our country's history to the 20s, you've got Great Depression. After that, you've got the New Deal. And there's this notion and there's this idea that we've got to make sure all Americans are taken care of. And we've got to make sure that we are driving our economy and we are stimulating our economy in a way that everybody can participate and that we can feed into our society and into each individual. But there were a couple of things that took place during that, and a few people were excluded. So first, we're going to talk about Social Security just because it's a fun fact. When it was created, there were two occupations that were excluded from that. It was agricultural laborers and domestic workers. And so if you think about the two populations that occupy that then, and likely still make up the majority of those occupations today, those people were excluded from Social Security at its inception. Now, beyond that, this is the time frame where the country determined it needs for people to buy homes. We're going to use homes as a method of wealth creation. And so we're going to start issuing mortgages. And these banks are looking at the federal government saying, well, why would we issue this mortgage? How are you going to make sure that this works for us? How are you going to ensure that this is something that we should be doing in a place where we'll lend our money? So the bank is going to, the federal government's going to insure those loans, but they are going to require area descriptions for the locations and the locales where these properties are going to be purchased. And those area descriptions look something like this. And I'm going to share my screen in just a second so you can see what an area description would look like. And my apologies here. This should have been a little bit more available, okay? And here we are. So now I'm currently sharing my screen, and I'm going to widen that for you so you can see it nice and clear. So this is within Los Angeles County, and this is how things would be described. So we got a class and occupation: Jewish professional businessmen, Mexican laborers, income. It shows that they're foreign families, 50%. It asks for the nationalities: Negro, 1%. Shifting or infiltration. So now this is asking what types of populations are moving into this area. And this says subversive racial elements are increasing. This is not war terms. This is not, battle strategy. This is how we're going to issue mortgages to Angelenos about 100 years ago. And we have Jewish professionals and businessmen and being described as subversive racial element that is increasing. Now I'm going to stop my share here. And I show you that because that is going to be a description of an area that is in red. So now if you go back to the map, you'll see the coastline. If you see the words Los Angeles, that's where the line is. And much of Santa Monica is either zoned non-residential or it's undeveloped. And then you'll see that red line portion around it. The reason why this is so crucial now is because we know and we understand the value of beachfront property now. But 100 years ago, this property was extremely undesirable. Nobody owned it. And in fact, or nobody really owned single family homes in this area. But what we did have was a low land cost and the ability and the capability of people that could get a mortgage, which wouldn't be any of those populations described in that area description. They could get a loan to build multifamily housing. But when they built that multifamily housing, the populace that lived within it, mostly foreign born, mostly minorities, those populations were at the whim of the property owner. Now, this is these area descriptions, and again, all of the regulation of the day in terms of the housing industry was conducted by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which is a predecessor to FHA. And if you can, again, take a look at the map, bordering the red, you'll see yellow. So that's a little bit above. And then you'll see the blue, which is a little bit above yellow. And then you'll see green, which is, that's the most desirable area. The greenest area on this map is Beverly Hills. It's where Beverly Hills currently sits today. And it's been green the entire time, right? And we know, again, because homeownership was linked to wealth creation in this country, that has been a very strong and secure area. However, if you look at all the other places on this map, the populations have changed, and we get into things in modern day problems now, such as gentrification, right? And displacement of vulnerable populations when new development occurs. And so again, going back to Santa Monica, which is underdeveloped or really a redlined area at the time, we have populations that are not able to build or to access financing for home purchase. They cannot get a mortgage. And so now what you have is this population, one, completely misses out on the wealth creation. But as people start to realize, oh, living by the beach is a beautiful thing and I would love to do it, the land values go up. And as development starts to happen in the area, these populations that were there 100 years ago, just a couple of generations ago, they're completely displaced. And in the way that this call was kicked off with recognizing the original inhabitants of the land of Santa Monica, and not that this is a one-for-one comparison, but we have to think about how we've artificially given value to land for the benefit of some and not others. And so I think this is really good context to have this conversation about affordable housing production and development in Santa Monica, because every area of Los Angeles could stand to build probably a little bit more housing, a little bit more affordable housing, even if they've hit certain marks and certain goals that have been described for them. They could probably do a little bit more because of the level of crisis that we are at. But going beyond that, it would seem to me that in recognizing the displacement of populations and the artificial preclusion from participating in wealth creation in this country, specifically in Santa Monica, that the hurdle to build that housing would be lowered with an understanding that these populations were kept out of this area because of their minority status or their foreign-born status and things of that nature. Just to take a little bit of step, because we are still living, hopefully at the back end of a pandemic, there are statistics that show that your life decreases as you move from the coast inland throughout Los Angeles County. And so if you think about the populations that have been, adversely affected at a disproportionate rate from COVID-19, and I say my time is coming up, those populations have, again, moved east from the coast. And so we can again see how that housing and that high opportunity area and that land value and that wealth creation has created a host of problems from those that originally lived there. And I'll stop there, and I'm sure there'll be some questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. It was very interesting. Our next panelist is Frank Gruber, who has been active in Santa Monica politics for almost 30 years, starting in the 90s with plans for the Civic Center, and as an official on the Housing and Planning Commission, as well as an observer as a weekly columnist for the Santa Monica Lookout News from 2000 to 2012, as a blogger, and as a candidate for city council twice. He's been on the board of various organizations, including the League of Women Voters of Santa Monica, and currently is chair of the Sierra Club's Los Angeles County Political Committee. Frank?
Okay, You always think you're not going to do that, screw up the unmuting. So thank you, Darlene, and I'd like to thank the League for inviting me to kick off what promises to be a very enlightening series of panels on housing. I first became involved in local politics in 1993 when I wrote a memo suggesting that the Civic Center plan reflect urban design principles. By 1994, to show how things can work in Santa Monica, I'd been appointed to the Housing Commission, and a year later, I was appointed to the Planning Commission. So I'm going to talk about some of these experiences. The context regarding housing then was that the city in the early 90s had lost a lawsuit brought by housing developers who contended that the housing element of the city's general plan did not take into account measures the city had enacted that prevented the building of housing. The developers won the case and got a lot of legal fees from the city, and the city had to change its policies to allow more housing to be built. You may ask, what did the city do that was so anti-housing development that it lost this case? The answer to that question is a bit complex, but is helpful for understanding things today. For most of the 80s, Santa Monicans for Renters' Rights, SMER, controlled city council. SMER leadership was committed to what it called a human-scaled community, in opposition, say, to the towers previous council had enabled to be built on the beach on beachfront in Ocean Park. This led SMER to oppose higher densities, even for affordable housing. While today we don't see a necessary disconnect between density and human scale, in fairness to people 40 years ago, the renter neighborhoods, not the city as a whole, but the renter neighborhoods like Mid-Wilshire, Ocean Park, and Pico were already among the most dense neighborhoods in California. From what I understand, the primary motivations for SMER's anti-housing policies in the 80s were not meant to be anti-housing, but rather to preserve rental housing in residential districts from being destroyed to build condominiums. This was a big problem. Conversions were a reaction to rent control, which had been enacted in 1979. The state passed the Ellis Act, which enabled the conversions. The city responded with limitations on new development in residential areas meant to make conversions less profitable. Another, at least putatively well-meant motivation was to get more affordable housing built. In 1990, city voters approved Measure R, which required that 30% of housing built in Santa Monica be deed restricted affordable. That goal was not itself unattainable, and in fact has been attained many times or consistently, and Measure R by itself would not have stopped development of housing. The city council followed up Measure R, however, with an enforcement ordinance that included draconian on-site requirements for projects with as few as 5 units. Measure R itself did not require on-site inclusionary housing, but the ordinance did. The results of these policies were that virtually no housing was built, at which point now I'm going to share my screen for this. I hope you see these two charts. You should see two charts, which these charts come from city documents, a housing element in 1990, and then another document later. I don't want you to concentrate on them because I want you to listen to me, but they're there in case you want to review the numbers that I'm about to give you. Based on data from past city housing elements, in 1990, the city had 47,753 housing units. Of them, you'll see on the first chart, roughly 9,000 were built before 1940, 7,500 in the 40s, 9,000 in the 50s, more than 10,000 in the 60s, and nearly 8,000 in the 70s. These were nearly all apartments since very early on after Douglas Aircraft, the R1 neighborhoods got filled up with single family houses. But you get to the 60s and only 3,617 were built. In the 80s, but only 3,617 were built in the 80s. These numbers, by the way, are the surviving units in 1990. They don't include units that have been torn down, such as when the freeway was built through the African-American and Latino neighborhoods of Santa Monica, destroying a lot of housing. So the production figures were actually higher by decade. The second chart picks up the story in 1990. You'll see that the 90s were a catastrophe for housing development. The net number of units in the city increased only 110 from 47,753 to 47,863 in 2000. Imagine that. The region was bursting with new immigrants as the population of the county increased roughly 600,000 from 8.86 to 9.5 million. Working class poverty and homelessness were becoming crises, but Santa Monica only added 110 units of housing. But after losing the court case in the early 90s, what did the city council do? Before I joined the two commissions, so I get no credit for this, the city passed what I consider landmark new zoning for downtown. The council, which for the most part was still controlled by SMER, still wanted to disincentivize building in existing neighborhoods to preserve rental units. But in the meantime, the city had opened the 3rd Street Promenade and the focus was on downtown. There was little housing there, and so there would be little displacement from new housing, and the city wanted to create a 24-hour downtown. Downtown was zoned for commercial development, but the council did something simple to encourage residential development there. It not only allowed residential development in commercial zones, but said that one could build twice as much on downtown properties if the development were residential instead of commercial, so-called double FAR. Not much happened immediately, as we know from the housing production numbers for the 90s. It took a while for developers to figure out what they could do. By 2000, the reforms started to take effect, and in the first decade of the new century, as shown in the second chart, you'll see from 2000 to 2010, Santa Monica had a net increase of 3,049 units to a total of 50,912, an increase of 6.4% over the decade, which was in fact a better rate of increase than the county as a whole. While I don't have data for the next date all the way through 2020, based on the 2020 Affordable Housing Progress Report, I do have it through 2019, and while the rate of development is slower, it's steady. As of June 30, 2019, the total number of units was 52,983, an increase of a little over 2,000 over 2010. That's close to the rate of 250 units per year forecast in the 2010 land use and circulation element, a growth rate of 0.5% per year. I just want to know, I've previously written that a good rate of increase for the city would be 1% a year, or about 500 units. To conclude, I'd like to repeat the timeless adage, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. What we saw in the 80s was that good intentions to save existing housing, when clumsily implemented, resulted in a drastic reduction in housing production that lasted about 20 years. Starting around 2000, based on corrective measures adopted only after the city was sued, housing production rebounded to a respectable level. But in effect, the big RHNA number that we all know the city is dealing with, the plan for 9,000 units in the next 8-year housing element, is really a makeup number. It's to make up for the years of little housing growth. Now I fear that good intentions focusing on the need for affordable housing will reduce not only the total number of units built, but also the number of affordable units. We saw this in the downtown community plan. It may feel good to require a market rate to developer to build 30% affordable, but it doesn't work if the developer can't make that work financially and instead builds a smaller tier 1 project with only 4% affordable units and many fewer units and smaller units in total. 20% of 1,000 units means more affordable units than 30% of 200. So thanks.
Thank you, Frank. Good timing.
Yeah, speed it up. I'll unshare my screen. How do I do that? Let's see. Oh, wow.
While you're working on that, Frank, I'll say thank you too. And I'll introduce Judy, who's our next presenter. Judy is a longtime resident of the Ocean Park neighborhood since 1974. She's been active on social justice and social service agency boards for many years, including Sojourn and OPCC, which is the predecessor to the People Concern. Judy also served on the Santa Monica City Council from 1988 to 1996, including 2 terms as mayor, one of which was during the 1994 Northridge earthquake, in which thousands of homes were damaged, as well as during the period of recovery from that damage, when the city had to utilize a multitude of tools to respond to a different kind of housing crisis. Judy?
Thank you, Darlene, and thank you to the League. I also was on the League board at one time. So, and my mother was a got a 50-year certificate for being a member of the League of Women Voters in LA. So just to establish my credentials. My part of this presentation is very personal about what happened when I decided to become a homeowner in Ocean Park. And the way that happened is that 3 of us decided that none of us could afford to buy a house, but if we worked together, we could put our money together and we could get a house and live together. So that seemed like a good idea. And we started looking, and we were on looking at a house on Pier Avenue that was too small for 3 people. And we looked across the street, and one of the people said, "Wait, I want that house." So, and pointed to the house that we ended up buying, which is behind me on the video. So we, the 3 of us, put our money together and went to get a mortgage to buy the house, which was owned by realtors, because the people who were living in it had stopped being able to pay their mortgage. So when we went to get our mortgage, we were told, "Oh, no, our bank won't loan there," by several banks. And why was that? Because it was redlined. Still in 1976. I didn't know what redlining was. And so it got explained to me that the banks would not give a mortgage to anybody in this area, except one bank, which was First Fed of Santa Monica. Now it's the One West. And they were Santa Monica based, and so they were willing to loan. It didn't have to do at that point with what race we were. We were all white. That wasn't the issue. The issue was whether a mortgage could be obtained in any way in Ocean Park. So anyway, that's how we got our house. And then, and Michael Tarbit's on this call, and he should be explaining this, but a bunch of us who were connected to the church in Ocean Park in some way or another, not in a religious way, but as activists, looked at Santa Monica and thought, what's happening here is that people are moving all the time. People don't live here very long. And there were lots of different reasons why that could happen. But the community wasn't cohesive because people were moving in and out. In fact, people didn't even know they lived in Santa Monica a lot of the time. They just lived on the west side and, near the beach or not near the beach. And so some people got together and thought, well, how can we stabilize the community and make it so that people could afford to stay? And that's not the political reason that rent control was passed, but that was what a lot of us were thinking about at the time. And so we worked on the rent control propositions, and there were a couple of them, but we got rent control. And the point was to stabilize the community, make sure that people could afford to stay here, because rents were going up dramatically and buildings were being torn down really often. So there would be a building there with lots of people living in it. All of them would get evicted, building torn down, and another building built, maybe as condos. And so that was kind of what the situation was in the late 70s. Rent control passed. And then people were more secure in their homes. And there are still people who live in the same place that they lived in the 70s, 80s, 90s, because they were stabilized in their housing costs. And they became a community together. Now, lots of other things were going on. Frank told you about some of those things. When I became when I was elected to the council and was in my last term as mayor, the earthquake happened. And so, okay, the earthquake happened. So the federal government comes in, the state government comes in and tries to help communities that have had damage. Well, there were rules about how that help worked. One of the rules was that the Small Business Association, SBA, would loan money or actually pay money for buildings, for businesses. So commercial businesses. But residential apartment buildings were not considered residential. They were considered businesses, but they didn't really fit in the business definition. And so here we were with 70% of our community renters, and meaning that 70% of the units were rental units. And how were they going to get rebuilt or repaired when the rules from the federal government, probably from way back? Josh, your information I thought was really interesting about why things were the way they were. And that's probably part of why the money for disaster relief was not really aimed at residential tenants, renters. And so we had to do a lot of very careful work with Bill Clinton and with the city of LA, because they had the same problem in Sherman Oaks where a lot of damage happened. We had to negotiate the federal rules and try to help them understand that if they were going to help us, they were going to have to deal with rental properties. And they did. We ended up getting an enormous amount of money for housing in Santa Monica. And I can't remember exactly how much it was, but it was not 100 million, but it was close, from the federal government to build housing, or to repair housing, and in some cases to rebuild. So all along the way, the policies matter a lot. And then there's the sociology of, well, who is able to live here? Who can stay here? How can a community be stabilized? And there we are today with lots of changes that have happened since then. So that's the end of my time, and we'll move right on.
Thanks, Judy.
Thank you, Judy. Our final panelist will be Jason Islas, who grew up in Santa Monica and graduated from Samo High in 2003. After volunteering with the Peace Corps, he returned to Santa Monica and worked as a journalist for about a decade before moving into a career in micromobility. I've never said that word before. He's also been involved in fighting for more equitable, inclusive, and sustainable housing policies. He serves on the Sierra Club Angeles Chapter Political Committee as secretary and as an elected member at large on the Angeles Chapter Executive Committee. Jason?
Thank you, Darlene, for that introduction, and thank you to the League for having me here. I always feel humbled when I'm asked to participate in these things. I don't really think of myself as a talking head, but I am a head who can talk. So, and I'm happy to talk about housing. I'm also returning to the board of the League, thanks to Darlene's efforts for re-recruiting me after an hiatus. As Darlene mentioned, I am from Santa Monica. I grew up here. I'm a product of Santa Monica schools. And that's sort of integral to kind of what I want to talk about in terms of my personal experience and how the history that was just laid out before you affected me as a child of of those policies, who grew up in those policies. The reason for me that being a product of Santa Monica schools is really important to me is that I am a first generation college student. I was both my mom and my dad are they're both working class Latino backgrounds. My dad actually has kind of multi-generational West Side roots. His mother actually had a family home over here on 17th Street near the college that the family sold after their father died, and it was redeveloped into apartment buildings in the 1970s. So my dad grew up not in Santa Monica, but on the West Side, but kind of in that milieu. My mom and he both met as grocery clerks. My dad tells stories about going to the grocery union meeting in downtown Santa Monica, which was next to the Pussycat Theater at the time. That theater no longer exists in downtown Santa Monica. I'm not sure it would be permitted to exist today. So I got into housing activism accidentally. I have no background in urban planning. I have no background in policy. I went away to college in 2000, in 2003 in Portland, Oregon. And when I came back to Santa Monica, I sort of started to realize a lot of things about the built environment of the city, the way it was designed, the way it was developed. You hear people talk about how much it's changed over the years, but I, as someone who grew up in the late 80s and the 90s, I'm coming back to Santa Monica in 2007, and then after 2 years in the Peace Corps, again in 2010. And I'm really not seeing a lot of change. I'm actually seeing a lot of stasis and a lot of the same. And I really sort of began to investigate, like, you might see like the facades of things change, but not really the actual built environment. And I started to realize there was a very kind of personal connection to housing. So I grew up 3 brothers, my mom and my stepdad together in a 1-bedroom in Santa Monica. For my life, my stepdad was also not a college educated person. And I have very distinct memories of my mother struggling with a question. And the question was, do I get out of this, what was a toxic and, for lack of a better word, abusive relationship, and uproot my children's lives, take them out of the school district, take them out of Santa Monica, because to her mind, keeping us in Santa Monica, keeping us in that housing and the access to the opportunity of Santa Monica schools was very much rooted in staying with my stepdad, who that was her only option as far as she saw it. That if she left him, she would lose housing in this what we now call in planning terms high opportunity area, where the schools are good, where the jobs are good. And we were talking mid-90s. This is LAUSD in the mid-90s. My mother was not willing to put us in that environment. She had ideas about what that meant to change from Santa Monica schools to LA schools. And so she had to make these sacrifices that I think I look today now, and as the price of housing keeps escalating, the sacrifices become greater and greater for more and more people who are generally lower income. And we talk about housing in the way it's a politics of scarcity that I think becomes inherently detrimental to poor working class people, and increasingly into the middle class. And I kind of became committed when I kind of just saw the some of the rhetoric around changes in Santa Monica, and remembering my mother's experience and some of the conversations we had about her feeling like she couldn't like leave the situation that she was in because it would uproot us and take us away from the schools. And thinking to myself, like, this is sort of the suffering that the scarcity we impose on the city, like it's the choices that forces people to make. And my mother's case was very emotional, very fraught, and but there are people who are, we're talking, you know, super commutes, we're talking all these things, sacrifices people make in order to be able to bring, you know, benefit from the economic opportunities in the city, and benefit from the infrastructure we've built that includes, you know, high quality education. And I saw that, like, look, the people who were complaining about a lot of the changes tended to be people who were okay, like they were stable in their housing, they were homeowners, they were people who weren't immediately affected by these big policy decisions that that really had like impacts on day-to-day life. So I'm a renter. I live in the Pico neighborhood. I feel like I kind of got, I mean, like with most of my life, I feel like it was a situation of mixed luck. You know, I got to go to Santa Monica schools, but that was on the sacrifice that my mother had to make. I live in the Pico neighborhood. I was able to move in here because when I did, it was with my partner at the time. She has since left, and I went from working in the nonprofit journalism sector, which was fulfilling work but didn't pay great. Kathy, I see you. I'm getting the light, as they say in stand up. But I went from working in the nonprofit journalism sector to having to find more lucrative work because my income was cut in half when my partner at the time moved back to South Dakota. And so my life has kind of been, you know, I'm renting, I'm in rent control, but my rent is, you know, roughly $2,000 a month. And so, and I'm 35, and I have to think very much like, there's no future for me owning in this city. And then I have to make sure that I just keep making enough money to be able to afford the rent. And thankfully, because of rent control, it won't go up too dramatically, but it still goes up. Anyway, thank you for listening.
Thank you, Jason. So we've heard from our 4 presenters, and now we're going to open it up for the question and answer period of our program. So I have a few questions, and if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll be able to access them. And as Natalia indicated, we might not get to them all, but hopefully we'll be able to get to enough of them that you will feel that you've been responded to. And a lot of them will probably somewhat similar. So let me start with one of the overarching questions in terms of why is the present situation called a crisis? Why do we think that we have a crisis, a housing crisis in Santa Monica? And how do you define crisis in that respect? And I'll start with you, Josh.
Thank you, Darlene. I would say that we have to label this a crisis because Santa Monica as a city has to accept and be aware of the role that it plays in this county and in this state. And if we're going to have a housing crisis in this state where we're millions of units short, I actually believe we're millions of units short. Well, yeah, in the state. And we know we have a higher poverty rate in Los Angeles County. We know we have a higher unit need in Los Angeles County. We know homelessness is off the charts in Los Angeles County. And I think Santa Monica just doesn't live in a bubble. And so it is surrounded on three sides by LA City. And there was the notion when the Expo line was getting built from its, detractors and opponents that those in opposition was that, we're going to bring in a lot of the homeless population from the eastern parts of the county and from closer to downtown. Well, we wouldn't be so concerned about, the homeless population riding the train into Santa Monica if we had housing for everybody. And that's not to say that Santa Monica needs to shoulder the load of all of it, right? Santa Monica plays a piece. It doesn't play the entire song of the band, so to speak. So I think that's how we have to look at it as a crisis for Santa Monica, simply because it's a crisis for all of us in Southern California and in the state in general.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Frank?
Everything Josh says, I totally agree with. You can look at all the data for the population in LA County, housing is so out of reach. Such a high percentage of households are paying more than 50% of their income in housing. That's one level. But I also want to talk about it in terms of Santa Monica and the way that people might not think about it. So Santa Monica, we have a traffic problem, but that traffic problem is mainly caused by people coming in here to work during the day because we have so many jobs and leaving in the afternoon, which Santa Monica residents who work in Santa Monica, it's not a problem for me. My office is a 10-minute bike ride from my house. It's not really a problem for my wife who worked at USC because she goes against the traffic. But when Santa Monicans here, when they find out about this is when they would try to leave the city. This was before COVID. And so that's our big traffic problem. Well, that's caused to a great extent by we have such a great jobs housing imbalance. And we built way too much. We built twice as much offices in the 90s than planned. And we hardly built, as I talked about before, any housing to go along with that. We also have a schools problem. For years, our schools haven't had enough children to keep them going. We've closed schools. We've had financial problems because of this. And it's a change in our community that people actually don't like. They like to have kids around. We have so many fewer. We also have, of course, the homelessness problem, which in Santa Monica is not just in Santa Monica, but you go across the line I was on Bundy today. On one side of the street, it's all tents. Santa Monica, it's not, because we actually have a proactive thing to give housing to people who might be putting up a tent, but it's everywhere. And we're not having built for that. And what Jason was talking about, my son is getting a PhD in ancient history. His desire in life would be to get a job at UCLA teaching. It used to be that a UCLA professor could afford to buy a house on the West Side. My son, on a UCLA salary and whatever his wife might have, they couldn't afford to buy a house in Santa Monica or a condo or whatever. And so we have to think about this housing element in a way that has an effect on people who in Santa Monica who don't think they're affected by the housing crisis. Not just the way it affects people who, homeless or low income and can't afford housing. It's at every level. It's a fungible problem.
Judy was next, Jason, and then I'll get to you. Go ahead, Judy.
So two things. One, before the freeway came, and we all know what awful things happened when the freeway came, but before it came, Santa Monica was an isolated community. People could not get to their jobs if they worked other places, and people couldn't come here to work much. Now, some people did, of course, but for the most part, Santa Monica was very isolated because all the streets were difficult. And that's part of why the freeway came here. So that's one thing. That was the context of this isolated island. And then the other thing that I wanted to say is that what we have now is a whole lot of big houses being lived in by one or two people maybe families grew up there and there were 5 or 6 people living in these houses, and now there's just 1 or 2 people living in them. That was the situation for my house. I have 6 people living in my house now, including me. And we live together really wonderfully. So just imagine if some of those big houses had lots and lots of people living in them, what a difference it might make in the neighborhoods and in the community itself.
Thank you, Judy. Jason?
It's almost like those big houses should become apartments. So and a bit to what I said, I think for me, there's a real crisis. It's a crisis of segregation. We may not be officially like doing, race covenants and things like that anymore, but increasingly the places in California and the cities frankly in the country where there's the most access to economic opportunity and good schools, basically the things that allow you to get a leg up in life, are increasingly unattainable to working class folks. Joss mentioned earlier when we did the covenant, when we did Social Security, we excluded agriculture workers and we excluded domestic workers, right? Was that, if that was correct?
Yes.
That wasn't unintentional. It was very much deliberate. We talk about things about who were the lowest wage earners. Women of color in this country are like criminally underpaid, but that translates into not being able to get a apartment in a place like Santa Monica where their kids could get a leg up, who could then go to college and get an advancement. So we are basically recapitulating segregation through an emphasis on the aesthetic of low density, an emphasis on preservation, community character, is really just a dog whistle for, I don't want people I don't know, that don't look like me, that aren't from the same culture as me, coming in and changing the community character. That's a real crisis if you believe in the promise of America being one of upward mobility and your background, history not being prediction.
Another question we have here is, how does the ability of currently housed residents, are they impacted by an increased density, and what is the response to that? And I'll give that to you, Frank. Unmute.
All right, I'm going to confess something, which is I spent my formative years in Center City, Philadelphia, and Tom Hayden once accused me of trying to turn Santa Monica into Philadelphia, which was not true. I really want to say I was not trying to turn Santa Monica into Philadelphia, but I'm going to be honest with you. I love cities. I love people. I live in Ocean Park, which is one of the most dense neighborhoods in Santa Monica. My wife and I first rented here when we first moved into Santa Monica. And as I think Judy said, we didn't even know that we moved into Santa Monica. We were in Venice and we rented a place in Ocean Park. We didn't even know we were moving to Santa Monica in 1983. We rented a place, then 4 years later, we bought our first place.
You were barely in Santa Monica.
I know, we were on Marine Street. Sorry, we were on Raymond for that. Then we bought a house on Marine, and then we have our current house. But it's one of the most dense neighborhoods. It defies every stereotype about real estate in America. We have an apartment building on one side of us, like 8 units. We have a lot split on the other side with 2 overlooking houses to us. We have a house, as Judy says, we're now empty nesters. But this neighborhood, I'm going to say something which is funny, it sort of goes, it's really interesting based on Joss's maps about what was considered to be blighted back then. Ocean Park on a per square foot basis has some of the highest real estate prices in California, which means the world. And so people really want to live in this neighborhood, which if you talk to somebody in an R1 neighborhood somewhere else in Santa Monica, they'll say, oh my goodness, we couldn't have an apartment building here. We couldn't have density. Density is, a horrible, it was a planning director in Los Angeles who once said the two worst words the two words that people hate are density and sprawl. But there's somewhere in between, and that's where you have these really good Wilshire, Montana, what a fantastic neighborhood, one of the densest neighborhoods in California. It's people think they don't like density, but they actually do. They like going out and seeing other people. So I'll leave it at that.
Judy?
When I moved onto my block, there were apartment buildings and there were single family houses and a few duplexes. And I loved the thing I loved about Ocean Park was that on any given block, there were people who were old, young, living, barely making it financially and relatively well off. And everybody kind of knew each other and got along. The question of what happens when density increases on my block now, my house is the only single family on my side of the street, and it's a landmark, so it's saved. But the difference is there are more people in my life. There are lots more people in my life because there are more people on my block, and I happen to like knowing my neighbors. So it sounds to people who are used to being in a totally single family neighborhood, it sounds really foreign to them. But in fact, it's wonderful to have all kinds of housing types, all kinds of people living on a block where you get to know each other really well.
Jason?
I mean, back to the point, so the single family sprawl paradigm was designed consciously to segregate. Communities do not thrive as monocultures. And I think that really some of I've lived in Koreatown, I've lived adjacent to downtown LA, I've lived in Eastern Europe, right, where they have a very different planning paradigm, and I've lived in Portland. And the reality is that people think of density, they say density and they think of buildings. We're talking about access for people, right? To Judy's point, to Frank's point, having neighbors is a good thing. Having more neighbors is a good thing. Having more neighbors from diverse backgrounds are really great things. I live across the street from a 100% affordable community corporation building. And when school's in session in the before times, I could just go out into my landing and I'd hear the sound of kids and families walking in front of my building to and from school. There's a strong Ethiopian community in that, and they at the park they celebrate, the various holidays there, and it's good to be exposed to that, to have people around you from different backgrounds, and I don't understand aversion to having new neighbors.
Okay, thank you. So is the only solution to this crisis, as it's been defined, to build high density units all over the place? And if that's at least, I'm sure, one of the solutions, how do we avoid it being targeted for in the low income, not low income for Santa Monica, but the minority areas where Black and brown people live, and not spread across the city so that everybody gets to have the joy of a lot of neighbors? And I'll start with you, Jason, since you have your hand up.
Yeah, so I mean, the last major growth in housing in the city of Santa Monica happened in response to a housing shortage. crisis, right? World War II ended. Santa Monica was predominantly fields and single family homes. In all the LA region and through the country to get all around, there was a lot of need to house more people. So the response was a little haphazard and slapdash. A lot of the housing, the vast majority of multifamily housing that was built in Santa Monica was built in the period after World War II to the 1970s. It's not great. It's not well planned. It's pretty haphazard. It's pretty slapdash. The reality is that we can't treat the planning of cities as the thing that like we're doing to like hold off change and density, because change is going to happen. It's just going to happen to benefit the wealthier and the more privileged folks if all the systems that we have in place are designed to prevent change. Because the change that will be prevented will be the change that's most challenging to people with the resources, with the political capital, with the actual, you know, and you know, right now there's a really big conversation around ending exclusive single family zoning, and that does not mean bulldozing, you know, your historic single family homes. It just means that you know, neighborhoods that were designed specifically to be more exclusively white and more exclusively wealthy now have to kind of let in more diverse building types. And the reality is that we need to be planning with a future-oriented idea, not with this notion that the goal of planning is to prevent as much change as possible. And, you know, look, density is not just New York in the 1970s. Some of the best cities in the world, Paris is actually denser than New York, but it's a better planned city. Barcelona is a gorgeous beachside city. It's incredibly inclusive and very well designed and dense. We're just going to have to deal with the reality that the lifestyle that Americans have gotten used to, that have really only existed for the past like 70 years, is just not sustainable if we want a more inclusive, equitable, and sustainable world.
Thank you, Jason. Josh, I see you nodding your head. What are your thoughts?
Yes, Jason makes a ton of great points. And I also want to weave into this conversation some of the other goals that we have as a society, and some of our sustainability markers and some of our environmental issues that we're combating. And, you know, density, you know, to Jason's point, doesn't just look like New York in the 70s. Now, you know, density in Santa Monica will look differently than density in downtown Los Angeles. And that will look differently than density in Inglewood, right? Because I do think there is this notion, and I think what people really love about Los Angeles in general is that neighborhoods have a different sort of a feel, and there's a ton of them. So you can go from Santa Monica to Hollywood to downtown to Inglewood to Leimert to Culver City and feel a little bit something different, right? But we can have that density in each of those areas without changing that feel, so to speak. And we're going to need to do that for a variety of reasons. One, environmentally, to reduce, you know, emissions as people are moving. And to Frank's point, you know, according to the traffic, Santa Monica is already pretty dense, right? During the day. It's at night when people are going to bed when it's not so dense. But so long as people are up, working, moving around, and commerce is happening, it's still a pretty dense city, right? So again, you can reduce that traffic, you can reduce, you know, emissions, you can be more environmentally friendly and environmentally sound. And, you know, part of that planning also goes into, you know, thoroughfares and streets and how we're designing this and how we're planning it so that people still have walkable space, green space, so that, you know, every single view of the beach is not obstructed by some giant skyscraper. These are all things that can be thought about and planned for by all the people that do this on a daily basis, if the will is there. And I think we have to get to a point where the will is there, because for all the reasons that have already been explained, we know that density can bring a lot of value to your life. You know, I recently moved post, you know, sort of mid-pandemic to Playa Vista but I lived downtown Los Angeles for about 10 years. And the thing that I love the most about downtown Los Angeles is that I walk to the gym, I walk to the dentist, I walk to work, I walk to the grocery store, I walk to the chiropractor, I walked everywhere I needed to go. And anything that was a little bit out of my reach, I just took the train. You know, I was carless in LA for about 4 years, which was like totally unheard of. And the only reason I bought one is because I recently had a daughter. So it's something that I think, again, makes people nervous and makes them a little bit hesitant to change, but there's so many benefits, and you really weave yourself into a neighborhood when you get to know your neighbors and when there are more people around and you can walk through these spaces.
Thank you. One of the questions we just had was, has there been any thought given to reparations for the Black families that were displaced when the Civic Center was built? And I don't know if anybody has a specific information or an answer to that question, but I'll start with you, Frank, since you're on the Planning Commission. Do you have any?
Yeah, well, I've written a lot about the Belmar Triangle area. It's a very complicated issue because the specific families. Well, okay. I mean, there are a couple ways you can look at it. You could say, take what's happening in Manhattan Beach, where the specific families who lost property that became very valuable, there's talking about getting their land back, at least a piece of it. And you could say, well, maybe there would be a specific reparations for the descendants of the families who actually lost property at that time. But I don't, there are legal issues about whether a city can do that. I don't want to go there. That's another concept. I actually, last Saturday, Allison Rose Jefferson, who's been the great historian of this whole issue,
Right.
she was on a panel that the Occidental College's Institute for the Study of Los Angeles put on. And she had a very eloquent answer about this, which I really can't paraphrase, but she was talking about some kind of more holistic kind of view about how you might look at it. But I know that I believe it's Kevin McKeown on council has suggested that if affordable housing, well, first of all, there is one affordable housing development at the Civic Center that's named after Belmar, but I don't think there's anything specific with that about getting descendants. I don't know if the descendants of those families would qualify for affordable housing, quite frankly. You know, they're families that have done very well in the world. I mean, they've lost very valuable property in Santa Monica, but I don't know. I just don't have an answer to that question. But Kevin has, I believe, said that if we build housing, I personally feel that at the site of the Civic Auditorium, the thing right now to do is to build a mixed affordable housing project that would have housing for homelessness, formerly homeless, low income, and moderate income at that area. And maybe there is a way to tie that into a kind of a reparations type situation. But yeah, it's interesting. It's really percolating how this Manhattan Beach thing is, I think, really going to make people think about this.
And just another interesting note on that, on your response in terms of there is actually a group, because I attended a lecture as well, that former Belmont Park people, residents, that they get together annually. And so they're still around. They have an annual meeting and celebrate, except for they didn't do it for COVID, but last year, but they, you know, they're still very active and they're still around. So I think maybe their input on that issue.
I mean, I've written about this, but I first learned about Belmar around 2001, when I went to a civic center workshop, and there was an older African-American woman there. And I just started talking to her, and be honest with you, not that many African-Americans came to that kind of planning event in Santa Monica in those days. And I just sort of was interested, well, you know, what brought you here, that kind of thing. She says, well, this used to be a Black neighborhood. And I said, oh, really? And, you know, no, I mean, I often say nobody in Santa Monica knew about that. Of course, no white people in Santa Monica knew about that.
Exactly.
And, you know, I was told when I first wrote about it that no white people in City Hall knew anything about it. It was kind of repressed from the memory, but the African-American community certainly knew about it, very, very much so.
Right. Thank you. So we've been talking a lot about Santa Monica and what they haven't done right in terms of not having enough density and enough housing. What things would you say they have done well in terms of housing and various other issues? Jason?
So I'll say this as someone who has benefited. I think, I think requiring some, so I think what's interesting about Santa Monica is that I feel like they brokered a piece in many, like from a policy perspective, between the desire of capital, essentially the property owners to build denser, and the desire of like the social benefit of trying to incorporate some sort of value capture, in this case, price restricted income housing. The problem I feel is that it's just never been coupled with a politics of abundance as opposed to artificial scarcity, right? So we have this great paradigm that Santa Monica really worked hard to get, namely like, look, if you want to build here, it's important for us as a community that you also, you're going to have tremendous economic benefit. We want some of that economic benefit to translate into something that benefits low-income folks, but then also turn around and say, but we're going to tremendously limit the just the sheer number of that benefit because we don't want big buildings or whatever. And so I think that like that's kind of the thing. We have to, we have that, and we have the preservation of existing rent controlled housing, which I think rent control is a great mechanism. I always say it is a necessary but not sufficient condition to maintain community stability and affordability. So those are the two things I would say.
Judy?
Well, I think one of the things we did right is we created Community Corporation. And that organization grew out of Ocean Park Community Organization, which was an early community organizing project that Michael Tarbett worked at, and I did. And what we did was we organized block by block and found out what people really cared about. And one of the things they really cared about was housing and affordable housing. And so we created Community Corp of Santa Monica by going to the city and saying, we need some money to start this. And they paid, the city council gave us money to hire an organizer around housing, affordable housing. And so that was one of the things that we were able to do. The other thing was that, and this may need to change right now, but we made zoning decisions that created a situation where rent-controlled housing was not able to be destroyed. And there was a reference to that earlier, that it didn't make in economic sense for a developer to tear down an apartment building because they couldn't build a condo building that was going to make them enough money to do that. So we did that, and we did it very deliberately and somewhat quietly to make those requirements get them passed. But it may be now that we need to relook at some of those and make sure that we have the ability for affordable units to be built, not only in Ocean Park, but all over the city.
Thank you, Judy. Frank, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to just to talk about what the city's done right. I'm going to go back to that 1990s law about housing downtown, and I'm going to make a personal story about it, which has to do with there was the first developer who figured out how to make it work down there. Actually, the first project he did was a deed restricted moderate income project. This guy named Craig Jones, kind of a crazy guy. But you need to be a crazy guy to develop in Santa Monica in those days, probably today too. But anyway, he was building apartments. He figured out how to do it under the zoning. They would, what you've seen downtown, retail on the ground floor, with 4 stories of housing above, which is what's a kind of development that's construction with that's cheaper with 2x4s with sticks. It was called sticks construction, not too high that you need to have steel, and it wasn't that expensive. And he figured out how to make that work. His first projects were really ugly, but there was a lot of back and forth with the city and him, and they got better. But he advertised for free rent. He said, "Hey, we have apartments opening up, 2 months free rent, 3 months free rent." He had a big billboard on Lincoln, and I wrote about that in a column I was writing. And my parents were back in Philadelphia, and they're in their 80s, and they don't have any children near them, and they say, "Oh, there are going to be apartments in Santa Monica." So they came out, and they actually rented one from the plants. They were the first people to move into a building on 6th Street, just north of Colorado. And they moved there in 2003. My mother passed away after 4 years, but my father lived there until he died in there, about 2 years ago. And okay, now you could say that didn't solve the housing problem in Santa Monica because somebody moved here from Philadelphia to take that apartment, but that apartment's still there. And that apartment's going to be there, for a long time, solving the housing needs of Santa Monicans. You could say that it solved a housing need for me. I got my parents somewhere where I could look, help take care of them, and that's what I did for my dad. It was, 5-minute walk from my office downtown Santa Monica. So I look at the neighborhood there is great, and there are people all over, and there's of course before COVID, the restaurant across the street, people sitting outside on Adirondack chairs waiting to get in all the time, and it was a real neighborhood, and that the city created a neighborhood. That's a really good thing. It's you don't have that every day. Not every city does that, and so I think Santa Monica should be very proud about that, and I think that it's a very replicable situation. It doesn't displace. Going back to the issue about whether housing gets put into the a Pico neighborhood, whatever. Well, this housing isn't there, and it keeps people from who might, have higher income people who might be cannibalizing low income, low rent apartments in the Pico neighborhood, gives them someplace else. So I think that the city can do that on its boulevards. I think there's a lot of capacity. We'll see how it works out in the housing element, but I think the city has a lot of capacity. We're seeing it on Lincoln Boulevard. I think there a lot of units can be built, and it will not really bother anybody in Santa Monica. It'll be a good thing.
Thank you, Frank. We have a question that says, the city has planned to address its regional housing needs allocation through incentivizing accessory dwelling units. And do you think it's realistic that these dwelling units, these granny flats basically, will be built with the intent of renting them out to non-family members? Judy.
I was at a workshop with the Metropolitan Water District Board yesterday. And one of the things they said about ADUs was something I hadn't thought about. And that is that in terms of water use on large parcels, lots of water is used to water landscaping. If an ADU is built, less water is used because the new construction uses newer fixtures that don't take so much water, and it becomes a very good thing for climate change. So right. I just wanted to throw that in. I very rarely would get a chance to talk about my water life.
Thank you, Judy. Jason?
I wanted to say, I think again, we have a lot of necessary but not sufficient answers to the housing crisis problem, and the ADUs. What they do is they open up single-family neighborhoods to things that aren't just big McMansions. They aren't, it gives people who own a house an alternative to, say, selling to someone who would then bulldoze an older house and build to the envelope. And if they rent to people who are family members, I mean, look, I know plenty of people I went to school with who would be back in Santa Monica if that was an option, but it isn't. The other option is to live in the same house as their parents, and they're not going to do that in their 30s. But if there was a separate unit that was on the same property, it's something they might consider. And I think, I think we're talking about things in terms of the politics and the rhetoric of scarcity, that there's this like necessary, like if something's built, is it just going to go to a family member? Is it just like the point is that we want policies that provide abundance that is accessible in an equitable way. And that makes up for historical inequities. But the key first is abundance. I'm a history nerd, and I always say, like, there are people who have, like, rightly so, I consider myself very much a leftist, but there are people who are rightly concerned with the way global capital works and the capitalist economic system works, and especially with regards to housing. But I always say, like, even the Soviet Union, who had the first, I would say, national non-market economy in the modern world, had to build tremendous amounts of housing because people, in order to access the promise of the Soviet Union, namely access to jobs and the productive areas, they needed places to live. And housing was miserable until the post-war period, because that's when they started to build housing in an abundance. And if we want equity, we need abundance, period.
Thank you, Jason. And I have one last question here, which is, what is something you wish you knew when you first got involved in housing advocacy, policy settings, et cetera? And I'll start with you, Josh.
So I come to housing primarily from a tax background, a tax policy background. And so, one thing that I wish I knew was, just how the regulatory burden of building and the regulatory burden that surrounds public subsidy to finance the acquisition and rehab or the production of housing, especially affordable housing. It is an incredibly complex issue area. And the hardest part about it is trying to explain it to someone who does not work in this field or this industry, or, whether they're a developer themselves or a journalist or somebody, who's just not in it every day. It's really, really difficult to explain, how the dollars go so quickly, or why it costs X dollars to build a number of units. And it's certainly not, to a lack of want or care. It is just an incredibly complex, industry. And that's something that I wish I knew, but it wasn't. So now we get to help simplify it a little bit.
Thank you. Frank?
Well, there's so many things that I have learned in the years that I've been involved in urban housing issues. We have, talked about parking. That's like, the thing out there that everybody ignores, but it's hugely impactful. But I think what's come to my realization sort of goes to Jason's point about abundance in a kind of from a different angle, is the connection between incomes and housing. So if you know the real cost of building housing, and now a lot of that is land, and that's a problem in the entire industrial world. We're not alone in having a housing crisis. Every industrial area in the world advanced has a housing issue. Housing always has to be subsidized. The suburbs are subsidized, because land close to what the people want to be to is going to get expensive. And we know construction costs are expensive and materials are expensive. And when you look at how much it costs to build a unit of housing, any kind of unit of housing, you start thinking, well, it's not that housing is too expensive. It's not that rents are too high. It's not that housing prices are too high. It's that people don't make enough money. Wages are too low. And so we've had a hit over the last 40, 50 years. This is what I'm really coming to, I wouldn't say realize, because I kind of know, but the connection, we've had this hit ever since, Nixon came in the early 70s, and then Reagan, where this kind of neoliberal kind of kill the unions, let wages go nowhere, kill good jobs. Attitude came in because it was always about GNP and this kind of productivity thing. And meanwhile, in Southern California, we had a huge demographic shift where millions of people came in, not highly educated, but hardworking, really looking forward to advance, but then the wage structure just got destroyed. And talk about the African American community, which had good jobs, union jobs. In a lot of fields, in industry and services, and those all got knocked out. And so I think that housing is one issue, but incomes have to go along with that. And so I'm really excited with what's going on in Washington right now with hopefully a transformational president. We will look at things differently.
Thank you, Judy. I'll let you go next, and we have a few minutes left, so I'll ask you to be brief. I'm sorry.
I wish I had known when I moved to Santa Monica that my grandmother had worked at Douglas Aircraft. I wish I had known that so that I could have asked her all kinds of questions that I never asked her, and I can't ask, and nobody knows anymore. And I wish that I had understood a lot more about generational memories and passing down information from one to another generation, and how important that can be in looking ahead. So that's what I wish I had known.
Thank you. And Jason, last comment to you, a brief one.
Very brief. Frank, it's not either or with wages and rents. The rents need to go down and the wages need to go up 100%. The one thing I would say I wish I knew when I started advocacy was how far the conversation would be today. When I started housing advocacy, I really felt like a voice in the wilderness, and really felt like what I was saying was like lost. I just did not. I mean, if there was Frank, there was Judy, there was a very few small group of people. Increasingly today, the conversation around housing, with Berkeley eliminating single family zoning, the whole states, I think Oregon got rid of it, or Washington, one of the two states, but getting rid of these things, like I would have not imagined 10 years ago when I started getting involved in housing advocacy that we would see this much progress this quickly in terms of how we talked about it. And I would have loved to tell myself back in 2011 and 2012, don't worry, it feels hopeless now, but it's gonna get better.
Thank you.
I've been telling Jason that for a long time.
Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Natalia for any closing remarks, because I think we're at the end of our time.
Thank you all so much for joining us today, and thank you to our fabulous panelists. We hope everyone will be able to join us next month. Our event is still being planned. It's a work in progress, but keep an eye out. Sign up for our newsletters, and if you are not yet a member of the League, why not? Join. It's really fun. So again, thank you all so much, and we hope to see you at the